July 20th, 1944, 12:42 in the afternoon. Deep in the forests of East Prussia, in a compound called the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler stands over a map table, discussing the collapsing Eastern Front. Around him stand 24 German officers and aides. Beneath that table, hidden in a briefcase, sits a British-made bomb. It will explode in 1 minute. The bomb was placed there by Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, a war hero, an aristocrat, and a traitor to the Nazi regime. If the bomb kills Hitler, Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators will execute Operation Valkyrie, an elaborate coup d'etat to overthrow the Nazi government and the Holocaust and negotiate peace with the Allies. If it fails, Stauffenberg and hundreds of conspirators will be tortured and executed. In 60 seconds, the course of World War II will either change forever, or the greatest assassination attempt in modern history will fail by the slimmest of margins. This is the story of the German resistance, the men who tried to kill Hitler and stop the Nazi regime from within. By July 1944, World War II had killed over 40 million people. The Holocaust was in full operation, millions murdered in death camps. Germany was losing on all fronts. The Soviets were crushing the Wehrmacht in the east, the Western Allies had landed in Normandy, and German cities were being bombed to rubble. Yet Adolf Hitler refused surrender, demanded total war, and promised to drag Germany to apocalyptic destruction rather than admit defeat. Inside Germany's military and aristocracy, a resistance movement had been growing for years. Officers and civilians who saw Hitler not as savior, but as destroyer of Germany. They'd tried to kill him before and failed. July 20th would be their last, best chance. The conspiracy involved hundreds of people across the German military, government, and intelligence services. It was the most extensive resistance movement inside Nazi Germany. And it came within inches, literally inches, of succeeding. If the bomb had been placed 2 feet to the left, Hitler dies. World War II potentially ends months earlier. Millions of lives might be saved. But it wasn't placed 2 feet to the left. And so Operation Valkyrie failed. By the thinnest of margins, through a series of accidents and bad luck, so improbable they seemed designed by fate itself. This is the story of the conspiracy, the bomb, the coup, and the terrible aftermath. This is Operation Valkyrie. Claus Philipp Maria Schenkgraf von Stauffenberg. Born November 15, 1907, into an ancient Catholic aristocratic family in southern Germany. The Stauffenbergs were part of Germany's noble elite, cultured, educated, connected. Claus was brilliant, poet, athlete, soldier. He studied history and literature before joining the Wehrmacht in 1926. He was everything the German officer class valued: intelligent, brave, devoted to duty and honor. Initially, Stauffenberg had been cautiously supportive of National Socialism. Like many conservative Germans, he'd welcomed Hitler's restoration of German strength and rejection of the Versailles Treaty. But by the late 1930s, Stauffenberg was becoming disillusioned. The Nazi regime's brutality, its lawlessness, its anti-Christian policies, and especially its treatment of Jews, disturbed him deeply. When war came in 1939, Stauffenberg served with distinction. In Poland, France, and Russia, he was a superb officer, organized, decisive, respected by his men. But he was also witnessing Nazi atrocities firsthand: mass executions, the Einsatzgruppen death squads, the systematic murder of civilians. And he was beginning to believe that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction. April 7, 1943. Tunisia. Stauffenberg's vehicle was strafed by British fighter planes. The attack was devastating. He lost his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left hand. Doctors didn't think he'd survive. But Stauffenberg's willpower was extraordinary. He recovered against all odds. He learned to write, dress himself, and function with his remaining 3 fingers. His friends called it miraculous. But the wounds changed Stauffenberg in another way. They gave him time to think. During months of painful recovery, Stauffenberg reached his conclusion. Hitler was destroying Germany. The war was lost. The only way to save Germany was to kill Hitler, overthrow the Nazi regime, and negotiate peace before total destruction. Stauffenberg's injuries had freed him from frontline duty, but they'd also given him something more dangerous: time to become a conspirator. Stauffenberg wasn't alone. A German resistance had existed since the 1930s. Military officers, politicians, intellectuals, clergy, and civil servants who opposed Hitler. Key figures included General Ludwig Beck, former chief of staff who resigned in 1938 over Hitler's reckless war plans. Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, former mayor of Leipzig, who would lead the post-coup civilian government. Henning von Treschow, a brilliant officer who tried to bomb Hitler's plane in 1943. General Friedrich Albert, who controlled the replacement army. Hans Oster and Admiral Wilhelm Canaris of the Abwehr Intelligence Service. And many others, hundreds of people, all risking their lives. They'd attempted assassination before. Bombs on planes poisoned chocolates. Suicide attacks. All had failed through technical malfunctions, luck, or last-minute changes to Hitler's schedule. By 1943, the conspirators understood they needed two things. First, access to Hitler to plant a bomb. Second, a plan to seize power in the chaos after Hitler's death. That's where Operation Valkyrie came in. Operation Valkyrie was originally a legitimate Nazi emergency plan. If there was an internal uprising, say, by slave laborers or POWs, the replacement army would mobilize to suppress it. The plan gave the replacement army authority to seize control of communications, government buildings, and infrastructure. It was a contingency plan that had been approved by Hitler himself. The conspirators' genius was to subvert this plan. They would fake an internal uprising by the SS, use Valkyrie to mobilize troops, arrest Nazi leaders, and take control of Germany, all under the guise of protecting the regime. The key was Hitler's death. If Hitler was alive, he'd simply cancel Valkyrie. But if Hitler was dead, the confusion and power vacuum would allow the conspirators to execute the coup before anyone understood what was happening. It was brilliant. It was audacious. And it depended on everything going perfectly. In late 1943, Stauffenberg was recruited into the conspiracy by Henning von Treschow. The resistance leaders immediately recognized Stauffenberg's value. He was brilliant, fearless, and, crucially, he now had access to Hitler. In June 1944, Stauffenberg was appointed chief of staff to General Fromm, commander of the replacement army. This position required Stauffenberg to brief Hitler personally on reserve army matters. It gave him access to Hitler's military conferences. It gave him opportunity. Stauffenberg became the conspiracy's key operative, the man who would carry the bomb, place it near Hitler, and trigger the coup. It was a death sentence. Even if the assassination succeeded, Stauffenberg would likely be killed in the coup's aftermath. But Stauffenberg accepted. Someone had to do it. Germany's future, perhaps the world's future, depended on Hitler's death. And Stauffenberg was willing to sacrifice himself for that. The date was set July 20th, 1944. By July 1944, Germany was collapsing. In the West, Allied forces had broken out from Normandy and were advancing into France. In the East, the Soviets had launched Operation Bagration, the largest offensive of the war, and were destroying Army Group Center. German casualties were catastrophic. Cities were being bombed daily. The war was clearly lost. But Hitler refused to negotiate. He'd issued orders for total war, fight to the last man, destroy everything, except no surrender. The conspirators understood. If they didn't act now, Germany would be utterly destroyed. Every day's delay meant more deaths, more destruction, more crimes against humanity. And there were practical concerns. The Gestapo was closing in. Several conspirators had been arrested or were under investigation. It was now or never. Stauffenberg had been scheduled to brief Hitler multiple times in June and early July, but Hitler had canceled or changed locations. July 20th would be Stauffenberg's next opportunity. It would also be his last. The weapon was a British-made plastic explosive with a mechanical time delay fuse. About 2 pounds of explosive, enough to kill everyone in a closed room. The fuse was ingeniously simple. Crush a small glass vial containing acid, which slowly ate through a wire, releasing a spring-loaded firing pin into a percussion cap. Depending on the strength of the acid, you could set delays from 10 minutes to 30 minutes. The bomb was silent and reliable. The conspirators had 2 such bombs. The plan: Stauffenberg would carry the bombs in his briefcase to Hitler's conference, arm them by crushing the fuse vials, placed a briefcase under the conference table near Hitler, then excuse himself and leave. 10 minutes later, boom. Hitler dead. Stauffenberg away from the blast. Coup begins. Simple. Except nothing about July 20th would be simple. July 20th, 1944. Berlin. Stauffenberg woke early. He'd said goodbye to his wife Nina the night before, though without explaining why he seemed so grave. At the Benler block, the replacement army headquarters, General Albrecht and other conspirators prepared for Valkyrie. They'd mobilized trusted officers. They'd drafted orders to arrest Nazi leaders. They'd identified which units would support the coup. Everything was ready. But everyone knew the plan had weaknesses. General from Stauffenberg's superior wasn't fully committed. He'd support whoever won. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, was supposed to be at the conference too. Killing both Hitler and Himmler would be ideal. And timing was critical. Stauffenberg had to arm the bomb, place it, escape, fly back to Berlin, and trigger Valkyrie, all within hours. Any delay, any complication, could doom the coup. At 7 a.m., Stauffenberg and his aide, Lieutenant Werner von Haeften, drove to Rangsdorf Airfield. They boarded a Heinkel He-111 bomber for the 3-hour flight to Rassenberg, East Prussia. In Stauffenberg's briefcase, 2 bombs, documents for his briefing and Germany's fate. The flight to Rassenberg took 3 hours. Stauffenberg sat quietly, reviewing his briefing materials. Did he pray? Did he doubt? We don't know. But he must have understood that in a few hours, he'd be dead or a hero, or both. His aide, Werner von Haeften, 36 years old, knew the plan and had volunteered to help. Haeften carried the second bomb. Together, they'd arm both bombs, place them in Stauffenberg's briefcase, and ensure maximum explosive power. At 10:15 a.m., the plane landed at Rassenberg Airfield. A staff car picked them up for the drive to Wolfschanz, the Wolf's Lair. Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters was a heavily fortified compound of bunkers, barracks, and minefields, guarded by SS troops. Getting in was easy. Stauffenberg was expected. Getting out alive after planting a bomb would be the challenge. But Stauffenberg was committed. He'd crossed the Rubicon. There was no turning back now. The Wolf's Lair was Hitler's personal hell, a claustrophobic compound of concrete bunkers surrounded by minefields and guards. Hitler had lived here, paranoid and isolated, since 1941. The compound had 3 security zones, each more restricted. Stauffenberg, as a senior officer, could enter the inner zone where Hitler worked. But security was still tight. Bags were inspected, weapons weren't allowed. Stauffenberg's briefcase was checked, but the guards didn't recognize the bombs disguised among papers. At 11 a.m., Stauffenberg reported to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's office. The briefing with Hitler was scheduled for 12:30 p.m. Stauffenberg had 90 minutes to prepare. He needed to arm the bombs. He needed to ensure he'd be positioned close to Hitler, and he needed to arrange his escape. Everything was proceeding according to plan, but then the first problem emerged. Stauffenberg learned that Heinrich Himmler would not be attending the conference. This was a blow. Himmler, as head of the SS and Gestapo, was arguably as important to kill as Hitler. With both dead, the coup would be much easier. Some conspirators had urged, wait for a day when both Hitler and Himmler are present. But waiting was impossible. This might be Stauffenberg's last chance. Besides, the coup could succeed with just Hitler dead. Probably. Stauffenberg decided to proceed. Then came the second problem. Hitler had changed the conference location. Instead of the underground bunker, a concrete room where the bomb's blast would be devastating. The conference was being held in a wooden barack with open windows. The blast would be far less effective. Stauffenberg must have felt fate conspiring against him, but he couldn't abort now. Too much was at stake. The conference would be at 12:30. It was time to arm the bombs. 12:15 p.m. Stauffenberg and Haeften found a private room to arm the bombs. This should have been simple. Crush the glass fuse vials with pliers. Place both bombs in the briefcase. But Stauffenberg's injuries made everything difficult. With only 3 fingers on his left hand, manipulating the delicate fuses was challenging, and they had only 10 minutes before the conference started. As they worked frantically, a sergeant interrupted. Keitel was looking for Stauffenberg. The conference was starting soon. He needed to hurry. Flustered and rushed, Stauffenberg managed to arm one bomb. But there wasn't time to arm the second. Haften shoved the unarmed second bomb into his own bag. This was a catastrophic mistake. With only one bomb instead of two, the explosive power was halved. In the wooden barrack with open windows, one bomb might not be enough to kill Hitler. But there was no time to reconsider. Stauffenberg placed a single-arm bomb in his briefcase, grabbed his documents, and headed to the conference room. The fuse was burning. He had 10 minutes. 12:30 p.m. The conference room was packed. About 24 people crowded around a massive oak table. Hitler stood at the center, hunched over maps of the Eastern Front. The news from the East was catastrophic. Soviet forces were crushing German armies. But Hitler, as always, refused reality. He demanded impossible counterattacks, blamed his generals for failures, and rejected any suggestion of retreat. Stauffenberg entered and was positioned near Hitler by Keitel. Perfect. Stauffenberg placed his briefcase on the table, as close to Hitler as possible, about 6 feet away. The bomb was now ticking. Stauffenberg had about 8 minutes before detonation. He waited a moment, listening to the briefing, then did something brilliant. He asked an aide to place a phone call to Berlin. Urgent, he said. This gave him an excuse to leave the room. As Stauffenberg walked out, the briefcase sat under the table, 6 feet from Adolf Hitler. The dictator had less than 10 minutes to live. But then fate intervened again. 12:37 p.m., 5 minutes before the bomb explodes. Colonel Heinz Brandt, trying to get closer to the map table, found Stauffenberg's bulky briefcase in his way. Annoyed, he moved it, pushing it to the far side of a massive oak table support leg. It was an innocent action. Brandt had no idea what he'd just done. He'd placed a heavy oak barrier between the bomb and Hitler. That table leg, thick and solid, would absorb much of the blast. Hitler, standing on the opposite side, would be partially shielded. If the briefcase had stayed where Stauffenberg placed it, Hitler would have been killed instantly, but it didn't stay there. And that movement, casual, unthinking, a matter of convenience, saved Hitler's life and doomed the conspiracy. 12:40 p.m. Stauffenberg and Haften were in a staff car trying to leave the compound, but the Wolf's Lair had multiple security checkpoints. At the first, guards saw Stauffenberg's credentials and waved him through. At the second checkpoint, the final barrier before the exit, a guard stopped the car. Stauffenberg's exit pass wasn't properly authorized for leaving without escort. Stauffenberg, a war hero and colonel, pulled rank. He had an urgent phone call to Berlin. Didn't they know who he was? The guard hesitated. Stauffenberg insisted. Meanwhile, seconds were ticking. The bomb would explode any moment. If it detonated while Stauffenberg was still in the compound, he'd be immediately suspect. The guard, intimidated by Stauffenberg's rank and aristocratic authority, let them through. The staff car accelerated away from the Wolf's Lair. And then at 12:42 p.m., the bomb exploded. 12:42 p.m. The bomb exploded with tremendous force. The wooden barrack was blown apart. Roof collapsed, windows shattered, walls blown out. 4 men were killed instantly or died shortly after. General Gunther Korten, General Rudolf Schmundt, Colonel Heinz Brandt, the man who'd moved the briefcase, and stenographer Heinrich Berger. Nearly everyone else was wounded, bleeding, deaf from the blast, in shock. But Adolf Hitler was alive. The oak table leg had absorbed much of the blast. Hitler's position at the table meant he was partially shielded, and the open windows had vented the blast pressure outward instead of concentrating it in a closed space. Hitler staggered out of the ruins, clothes torn, hair singed, eardrums damaged, legs peppered with splinters. But he was walking. He was conscious. He was alive. And he was furious. Stauffenberg, driving away from the compound, saw the explosion, smoke, flames, debris. The blast had been massive. From a distance, it looked like total destruction. Stauffenberg turned to Haften and said, "No one in that room could have survived." He believed Hitler was dead. The mission was accomplished. Now they just had to get back to Berlin and execute the coup. as they drove to Rassenberg airfield. Stauffenberg was calm, even optimistic. In a few hours, he'd be in Berlin, triggering Operation Valkyrie. By nightfall, the Nazi regime would be overthrown. The war would end. Germany would be saved. He had no idea that at that very moment, back at the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler was standing up, brushing debris off his uniform, and ordering his security forces to find out who tried to kill him. The coup was already doomed, but Stauffenberg didn't know that yet. Hitler's first action after the explosion was strategic genius. He ordered all communications from the Wolf's Lair shut down. No phone calls in or out. No radio messages. Total information blackout. This had two effects. First, it prevented whoever planted the bomb from knowing if Hitler was alive or dead. Second, it bought time to identify and arrest conspirators before they could act. For the next 3 hours, Germany existed in a strange information void. The conspirators in Berlin didn't know if Hitler was alive. The Wolf's Lair didn't know who'd planted the bomb. And Germany's military and government didn't know whether to follow coup orders or remain loyal. In this fog of confusion, everything would be decided. Stauffenberg and Haeften boarded their plane at 1 p.m. and took off for Berlin. The flight would take 3 hours. 3 critical hours when Stauffenberg couldn't communicate with conspirators in Berlin. Before takeoff, Stauffenberg tried to call the Bendler block to confirm Hitler's death and order Valkyrie initiated, but he couldn't get through. All lines from the Wolf's Lair area were down. Stauffenberg assumed this was because of the chaos from the explosion. He didn't know it was Hitler's deliberate information blackout. During the flight, Stauffenberg was unreachable. And in Berlin, the conspirators faced an agonizing dilemma. Should they launch the coup without confirmation that Hitler was dead? General Albrecht wanted to wait for Stauffenberg's return. Others argued they should act immediately. Precious hours were being wasted. By the time Stauffenberg landed in Berlin at 4 p.m., the conspiracy was already beginning to unravel. 4 p.m., Stauffenberg arrived at the Bendler block and immediately ordered Operation Valkyrie executed. Teletype messages went out to military districts across Germany. The Führer Adolf Hitler is dead. An unscrupulous clique of non-combat party leaders has attempted to exploit the situation to stab the fighting front in the back and seize power. The government has declared a state of emergency and transferred executive power to me. Signed, Field Marshal von Witzelben. It was a masterful deception. The message claimed the SS had attempted a coup, and the Wehrmacht was restoring order. Many units believed it and began mobilizing. In Berlin, Major Otto Ernst Riemer, commander of the Guard Battalion, was ordered to arrest Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister. In Paris, military governor Karl-Heinrich von Stauffenberg arrested the entire SS and Gestapo leadership. For a few hours, the coup seemed to be working, but there was one fatal problem. Hitler was alive, and word was starting to spread. 5 p.m., Major Riemer arrived at Goebbels' office to arrest him, but Goebbels was a master propagandist and manipulator. He asked Riemer, "Do you recognize my voice?" Riemer said yes. "Then," said Goebbels, "you'll recognize his voice too." He handed Riemer a telephone. On the other end was Adolf Hitler, very much alive. Hitler promoted Riemer on the spot to colonel and ordered him to suppress the coup. Riemer, convinced by Hitler's living voice, switched sides immediately. This was the coup's death knell. If troops believed Hitler was alive, they wouldn't follow coup orders. And Goebbels immediately went on radio to announce Hitler had survived an assassination attempt by a small clique of ambitious officers. The information war was won by the Nazis. The coup was collapsing. By 6 p.m., the conspirators at the Bendler block knew they'd failed. Reports confirmed Hitler was alive. Military units were ignoring Valkyrie orders or actively opposing them. General Fromm, who'd been under house arrest by the conspirators, was freed by loyalist officers. Fromm immediately took command and began arresting conspirators, partly out of loyalty, partly to cover his own connection to the plot. The Bendler block was surrounded. There was no escape. Stauffenberg, Albrecht, and the other core conspirators were trapped. Some pulled out pistols. There was a brief exchange of gunfire. Stauffenberg was wounded in the shoulder, but resistance was futile. By 11 p.m., all the conspirators in the Bendler block had been arrested. Midnight, General Frum, desperate to eliminate witnesses to his own involvement, convened an immediate court-martial. There was no real trial, just a summary proceeding. 5 men were sentenced to death: Stauffenberg, Albrecht Haften, Colonel Albrecht Mertz von Quernheim, and Lieutenant von Haften's brother. They were taken to the courtyard. In the glare of vehicle headlights, they were executed by firing squad. Stauffenberg's last words, shouted as the shots rang out, were, "Long live sacred Germany." Then silence. Claus von Stauffenberg, the man who come closest to killing Hitler, was dead at 36. But his execution was merciful compared to what awaited the other conspirators. Hitler wanted revenge, and Hitler's revenge would be horrific. Hitler survived the explosion with minor injuries: burst eardrums, singed hair, splinters in his legs. But psychologically, the assassination attempt devastated him. Hitler had always been paranoid. Now his paranoia became extreme. He trusted no one. He saw traitors everywhere. And he wasn't entirely wrong. The conspiracy had involved hundreds of people across the military and government. Hitler's response was systematic extermination. He ordered the Gestapo to investigate, arrest anyone with even tangential connection to plot, and execute them publicly in the most humiliating and painful ways possible. Heinrich Himmler was put in charge of the purge. Hitler told him, "This time we'll settle accounts in the manner to which we National Socialists are accustomed." It was a death sentence for hundreds. The Gestapo investigation was ruthless and efficient. They arrested over 7,000 people. Most were imprisoned. Many were tortured. The conspirators who survived the initial executions faced show trials at the People's Court, presided over by the fanatical Nazi judge Roland Freisler. Freisler screamed at defendants, insulted them, denied them proper defense. The trials were filmed for propaganda, meant to humiliate the conspirators and intimidate any future resistance. Convictions were foregone conclusions. Sentences were death, usually by hanging with piano wire, slowly strangling the victims. Hitler ordered the executions filmed so he could watch. Plötzensee prison in Berlin became the site of mass executions. The method was deliberately cruel. Victims were stripped, hanged from meat hooks with piano wire nooses, and left to slowly strangle, sometimes taking 20 minutes to die. Among those executed this way, General Friedrich Albrecht, who had helped plan Valkyrie; Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who would have led the post-coup government; General Ludwig Beck, the spiritual leader of the resistance, though he was allowed to attempt suicide, and when he failed, was shot; Karl Friedrich Gordeler, the designated post-coup chancellor; Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr intelligence service; Henning von Treschow, who'd orchestrated earlier assassination attempts. He committed suicide on the Eastern Front when he learned the plot's failure. And hundreds more: officers, civil servants, clergy, aristocrats. Estimates vary, but at least 200 conspirators were executed, possibly more. Their families were arrested under Sippenhaft, blood guilt, and sent to concentration camps. Nina von Stauffenberg was pregnant with her 5th child when her husband was executed. She was immediately arrested and imprisoned. Her children, ages 10, 9, 5, and 2, were taken away and placed in an orphanage under false names. The Nazis intended to erase the Stauffenberg name from history. Nina survived the war and was liberated by Allied forces in 1945. Her children were eventually found and returned. Her daughter, born in prison in January 1945, survived, but the trauma of July 20th haunted the family forever. Other conspirators' families suffered similarly. Wives imprisoned, children orphaned, properties confiscated, names erased. The Nazis extended guilt to entire bloodlines. The investigation revealed that the conspiracy was far more extensive than Hitler had imagined. It included field marshals and generals at the highest levels of the Wehrmacht, intelligence officers in the Abwehr, diplomats and civil servants throughout the government, clergy, both Catholic and Protestant, who opposed Nazi anti-Christian policies, former politicians from Democratic parties, aristocrats who saw Hitler as destroyer of German honor, and even some Nazi party members who become disillusioned. The The conspiracy stretched across Germany into occupied territories and had international connections. In Paris, the military governor had arrested the entire SS and Gestapo staff. In Vienna, officers had prepared to seize power. In other cities, sympathetic officers waited for word. It was the largest internal resistance movement in Nazi Germany. Proof that not all Germans supported Hitler, that a significant portion of the military and elite opposed the regime. But they'd failed, and their failure ensured Hitler would rule until Germany's total destruction. What if the bomb had killed Hitler? Could the conspiracy have succeeded? Could the war have ended in July 1944 instead of May 1945? We'll never know. But consider, if Hitler had died and the coup succeeded, Germany might have negotiated peace. Unconditional surrender to the Allies, immediate end to Holocaust, immediate cessation of combat. The final 10 months of World War II were the deadliest. Millions died on the Eastern Front as the Soviets pushed into Germany. Hundreds of thousands died in concentration camps in the final months. German cities were bombed to rubble. The Battle of the Bulge, the Battle of Berlin, the final desperate fighting, all would have been avoided. Perhaps 3 to 5 million lives might have been saved. But it didn't happen. The bomb was moved 2 feet. Hitler survived. And the war continued for 10 more months of hell. During the remaining months of Nazi rule, the July 20 conspirators were portrayed as traitors, cowards, and criminals who'd stabbed Germany in the back. Nazi propaganda films showed the people's court trials, with Judge Freisler screaming insults at dignified officers and aristocrats. The message: this is what happens to traitors. Their families were persecuted. Their names were cursed. They were written out of history. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the conspirators were still officially criminals and traitors in German eyes. After the war, Germany slowly began to reevaluate the July 20th conspirators. Initially, many Germans still viewed them as traitors. They'd broken their military oath, attempted to kill their commander-in-chief during wartime. But gradually, a new narrative emerged. The conspirators were heroes, Germans who tried to stop Hitler from within, who'd risked everything to save Germany from destruction and end the Holocaust. They represented the other Germany, the Germany that opposed Nazism. By the 1950s and 60s, memorials were being erected. Streets were renamed after Stauffenberg. The Benler Block courtyard where they were executed became a memorial site. July 20th became a symbol of resistance to tyranny and the importance of individual conscience over obedience to evil orders. The July 20th plot raises profound ethical questions. Is assassination ever justified? The conspirators would say yes. When a leader is committing genocide and destroying your nation, killing him is moral duty. Was it treason? Legally, yes. Morally? The conspirators argued they were loyal to the true Germany, not to Hitler's criminal regime. Should they have tried to kill Hitler earlier? Probably. By 1944, millions had already died. The Holocaust was nearly complete. An earlier coup might have saved far more lives. But earlier attempts had failed, and the conspiracy took years to develop. Did their failure matter? Yes, because it proved that internal German resistance existed, that not all Germans were complicit, and that some were willing to sacrifice everything to stop Hitler. Even in failure, they provided a moral example. Who was Claus von Stauffenberg? A hero? Absolutely. He risked and lost everything to try to stop Hitler. But he was also flawed. He'd initially supported aspects of National Socialism. He'd fought in wars of aggression, Poland, France, Russia. He'd witnessed atrocities, and only gradually turned against the regime. His motivations were complex. Yes, moral outrage at Nazi crimes, but also aristocratic disgust at Hitler's vulgarity, military professionalism offended by Hitler's incompetent war leadership, and nationalist desire to save Germany from destruction. He wasn't a perfect moral exemplar, but in the end, when it mattered, Stauffenberg chose conscience over obedience, sacrifice over safety. He tried to kill Hitler knowing he'd probably die. That takes extraordinary courage. So, yes, he was a hero. Complicated, flawed, late to resistance, but a hero nonetheless. In modern Germany, July 20th is commemorated annually. The German Bundeswehr, the modern armed forces, swears in new recruits at the Bendler Block Memorial, connecting military service to the legacy of the conspirators. The message: soldiers must obey conscience, not blindly follow orders. If ordered to commit crimes, they must resist, even at personal cost. This is Germany's attempt to ensure that "I was just following orders" can never again be an excuse. The July 20th conspirators are taught in schools as examples of moral courage. Their names grace streets, schools, and military bases. They represent the possibility of resistance even in totalitarian regimes, proof that individuals can choose to fight evil, even when surrounded by it. For Germany, they're a source of pride in a dark history. Germans who resisted Hitler, who tried to stop the Holocaust, who chose honor over obedience. They failed, but their attempt matters, because it shows that even in the darkest times, some people choose to do right. Let's examine exactly why Hitler survived. The bomb was powerful enough to kill everyone in that room, if it had been in the right position. Stauffenberg placed it about 6 feet from Hitler, lethal range. But Colonel Brandt moved it to the far side of the heavy oak table support. That movement created 2 protective barriers. The thick oak table leg absorbed blast force, and the mass of the table itself created a blast shadow. Hitler, standing on the opposite side, was partially shielded. Additionally, the wooden building with open windows vented blast pressure outward instead of concentrating it. If the conference had been in the concrete bunker as originally planned, the confined space would have made the blast devastating. Everyone dies. If Stauffenberg had armed both bombs instead of just one, the double explosive power might have overcome the table leg protection. If Brandt hadn't moved the briefcase, Hitler dies. If the table leg hadn't been there, Hitler dies. 2 feet. That's how close the assassination came to succeeding. What if the bomb had killed Hitler? Let's imagine 12:42 p.m., July 20th. The bomb explodes. Hitler is killed instantly. Stauffenberg returns to Berlin and confirms Hitler's death. Operation Valkyrie proceeds smoothly. By evening, the Wehrmacht has arrested Nazi leaders: Himmler, Goebbels, Göring, and others. The SS and Gestapo are neutralized. The new government, led by Beck and Gordeler, declares Hitler was a criminal who'd led Germany to ruin. They announce immediate cessation of Holocaust operations, release of political prisoners, and offers of peace to the Allies. But here's the problem. Would the Allies have negotiated? Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had committed to unconditional surrender at Casablanca in 1943. They wouldn't negotiate with any German government, even a post-Hitler one. So even with Hitler dead, Germany would likely have had to surrender unconditionally. But it could have happened in weeks instead of months. The Holocaust would have ended immediately. Perhaps 200,000 to 500,000 death camp prisoners might have survived instead of being killed in the final months. The final brutal fighting, the Battle of the Bulge, the siege of Berlin, the destruction of German cities, would have been avoided. Perhaps 3 to 5 million lives saved. The map of post-war Europe might look similar, but the human cost would have been significantly less. That's what 2 feet of distance costs a world. But let's be realistic. Even if Hitler had died, the coup faced enormous challenges. The SS was a powerful parallel military force. Hundreds of thousands of armed fanatics loyal to Nazi ideology. Would they have surrendered peacefully? Doubtful. Civil war between Wehrmacht and SS was likely. Some Wehrmacht units would have remained loyal to Nazism even without Hitler. The conspiracy's plan to blame the assassination on the SS and claim they were restoring order was clever, but would it have worked nationwide? Questionable. Goebbels, Himmler, and Göring were still alive and would have fought for power. The Gestapo would have resisted, and most importantly, the Allies would negotiate. Even a post-Hitler Germany would face unconditional surrender. So at best, the coup succeeds domestically, Germany surrenders within weeks, and millions of lives are saved. At worst, Germany descends into civil war between Wehrmacht and SS, prolonging the chaos. Most likely, something in between. The coup succeeds in Berlin and some regions, fails in others. Germany surrenders within 1 to 2 months. Holocaust ends immediately, and the war concludes with somewhat less destruction, but still total German defeat. July 20th, 1944 is one of history's greatest what-ifs. A briefcase moved 2 feet, 2 bombs instead of 1, a concrete bunker instead of a wooden building. Any of these differences, and Hitler dies. The conspiracy came so close to success that failure seems almost like divine intervention or cosmic bad luck, depending on your perspective. It teaches us that history is inevitable. Small accidents and coincidences determine enormous outcomes. If Colonel Brandt hadn't been annoyed by a briefcase in his way, world history changes. That's both terrifying and humbling. It means we're less in control than we think. But it also means individual actions matter. Stauffenberg tried and came within inches of succeeding. The bomb plot failed. But the attempt itself proved that resistance was possible, that some Germans oppose Hitler, and that individual conscience can resist totalitarian evil. Sometimes the attempt matters even when it fails. Today, you can visit the Benler Block in Berlin, now called the Benler Block Memorial. The courtyard where Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators were executed is marked with memorial. Inside is a German Resistance Memorial Center, documenting all forms of resistance to Nazism. Every July 20th, Germany's government and military hold ceremonies honoring the conspirators. It's become a site of pilgrimage for those who believe that resisting evil, even at personal cost, is the highest form of patriotism. The message is clear. These men were heroes, not traitors. They represent the Germany that opposed Hitler, the possibility of resistance, and the importance of individual moral courage. Operation Valkyrie failed. The bomb didn't kill Hitler. The coup collapsed within hours. The conspirators were hunted down and executed. Their families were persecuted. And the war continued for 10 more months, killing millions more people unnecessarily. By every practical measure, July 20th, 1944 was a disaster. And yet it matters. It matters that some Germans tried to stop Hitler. It matters that military officers and aristocrats risked everything to end the Nazi regime. It matters that they chose conscience over obedience, sacrifice over safety. Their failure doesn't diminish their courage. Claus von Stauffenberg walked into Hitler's headquarters with a bomb, knowing he'd probably die, and planted it anyway. That's heroism. The bomb was moved 2 feet. That accident saved Hitler and doomed millions. But the attempt itself proved something important. That resistance is always possible. That individuals can choose to fight evil, even from within. That sometimes the right thing to do is resist, even when you know you'll lose. Stauffenberg lost. But his sacrifice teaches us that trying matters. That moral courage means acting even when success is uncertain. 75 years later, we remember Operation Valkyrie not for its failure, but for what it represents. The eternal struggle of conscience against evil, of individual honor against totalitarian power, of those who refuse to be complicit in crimes. They failed, but they tried. And sometimes trying, truly trying, risking everything, is the only victory that matters. This was Operation Valkyrie. Remember it, honor it, and learn from it. Thank you for watching this comprehensive documentary on Operation Valkyrie and the July 20th plot to kill Hitler. If this story moved you, please subscribe, and share. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Were the conspirators heroes or traitors? Could the coup have succeeded if Hitler had died? What would you have done in their position? How do we balance military obedience with moral conscience? What other resistance movements should we document? Your engagement helps us create in-depth historical content that examines not just what happened, but what it means and what it teaches us. Until next time, remember the past, especially the stories of those who resisted evil at terrible personal cost, because their sacrifice reminds us that we always have a choice. Always.